Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'm going to talk about Saint Thomas's fifth proof for the existence of God. This is in the Summa Theologica, which is, in the version I have it, a 5-volume set this big. And it's very, very systematic. So question 1 is the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. Question 2 is whether God exists. Sorry, let's get to it. Yes, the existence of God, I should say. First article in question 2, whether the existence of God is self-evident. And the second article is whether it can be demonstrated that God exists. And then the third article is whether God exists. So I'm going to read the first two objections. The way the Summa Theologica works is for every article you have, what you get is what the question is about. You get objections. That is to say, it starts off with counter-arguments, and then on the contrary, and then finally reply to the objections. So I'm going to just read the objections here. Objection 1. It seems that God does not exist, because if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If, therefore, God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world. Therefore, God does not exist. Objection 2. Further, it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. But it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. For all natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there is no need to suppose God's existence. Now, St. Thomas then goes on to say, in the on the contrary section, he then goes on to give 5 proofs for the existence of God. In the typical phrasing, this can be known in 5 ways, or this can be proved in 5 ways in this case. And then after that comes replies to objection 1 and 2. I'm not going to get into them. I just wanted to include them. Just St. Thomas was in the 1200s, and I just want to include them to show sort of the seriousness with which St. Thomas is grappling with things. Anyway, the fifth way, and I think I'm going to do a scripted video on this at some point, because it really needs a proper scripted video with a carefully laid out response. But given what life is like for me right now, I'm doing this now as a placeholder until I have time to do a scripted video, which may not be for a while. Okay, so I'm going to read the fifth way. This is often a very neglected one of the proofs, but I think in many ways it is probably the most intuitive, and it is in some ways the most manifest, although I am disagreeing with the angelic doctor here. Well, actually, in a different... I think it's in a different work that he calls the argument for motion the most manifest way. Anyway, here's the fifth way. The fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly, do they achieve their end. Now whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as an arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore some intelligent being exists, by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Now, I said that it's probably the most manifest, in some ways the most intuitive and easy of the methods, but there's a detail on that. It is also, at present, the most misunderstood of the ways. And it is the most misunderstood of the ways because the typical response you will get nowadays is, but evolution! Well, not precisely like that, but more or less. The thing that people will object here is that, evolution, however, explains how a thing that is directed, or how a thing which has no direction still seems to achieve an end. I'm kind of pretending people actually know what end means, for example. Seems to act according to a purpose. even though it really isn't, simply because there is a sort of simple rule that happens to be governing it such that it comes out like this anyway. So, in particular, of course, that rule is, it's going to be some version of survival of the fittest. And it doesn't, I mean, so the way it'll typically go, let me state it clearly first, is roughly speaking that if you have survival of the fittest, what will happen over time is if you start with something that can reproduce itself, over time, it'll keep on reproducing itself if there can reproduce itself with changes. Changes for the better will be preserved and changes for the worse won't be. And over time, these changes will accumulate until you get things changing and you get more complex circumstances, and then these more complex circumstances themselves will tend to promote additional changes until eventually you start getting incredibly complex things that work together, where they work together only because you get many sort of iterations, and only the ones that work get preserved and the rest fall away. And so because of this complex iterative process, what you wind up with is things that look like they were designed, but they were not designed. They were only iterated many times under this rule that only things that work are able to, then reproduce themselves again. And I'm oversimplifying, and I'm also going to oversimplify the particular analysis because it doesn't really matter very much. But basically, I'm going to just say, so far as this goes, fine, it doesn't really matter. Yes, it is possible to get through iteration and preservation of only some changes. It is possible with a great deal of iteration and most things having been scrapped and thrown out. Eventually, you can acquire some changes that look like somebody designed them. And if there was somebody there to design them, they would have done a much quicker, much faster job of it. That said, that's not really the interesting part here. That's not really the very relevant part. When Saint Thomas is talking about how these natural things act as if towards an end, what he's not referring to is that they are doing something complex instead of something simple. It's easy to mistake it for being that, but that's not what he's actually saying. Because when he talks about an end, what he's invoking is the idea of by an end is a rational good. And by rational good, what I mean in particular is, I'm trying to think how to explain this best. Essentially, a composite good. Things are rational goods in the material world when they are composite things where the composition of these many parts capable of existing independently, that don't need each other, combined produce something that is real and greater than merely the individual parts, or even the sum of those individual parts. So to give a really simple example, if you have a piece of chalk and you have a chalkboard, those are sort of two things. When you take the chalk and you rub it on the chalkboard in particular ways, so as to, say, write a beautiful poem, you have something which is greater than just these two components because you have put them into a rational ordering, or a rational relationship. That is to say, a relationship wherein they are rationally intelligible to be something else. And not as unfortunately, the examples that I'm giving, because they're human constructs, are susceptible to the objection that what you've got is people who are simply imposing a rational idea onto something which isn't there. And I'm going to address that in a moment. So I'm just bringing this up because that's not the case, and so bear with me because I will explain why in a bit. Or again, you could take a bunch of colored chalks, and you have 8 different colored chalks, and you have a chalkboard, and then you can draw a beautiful picture using different colors. And by putting them in different places, what you produce is a painting, or chalk in this case, but you produce a picture, and a picture of something which communicates to a mind rational information. And this is not the only example by any means. Another simple example is a cell more than the sum of its parts, and is a human being more than just a collection of cells. And you can see, in fact, that it is because there is a difference between a live human being and a corpse. They're the same matter, but in a different relationship. The matter is in a different relationship. But if you take a person and then just put them in a room filled with nitrogen gas and wait, I forget what it is, something like 10 minutes, they'll be dead. There'll be a corpse on the floor. This corpse on the floor, though it's made of the exact same matter, is not the same thing as the human being who was there before. The live human being is something more than that corpse on the floor. Even though you've got just as much energy there, you've got the same matter that is present, and yet that human being is more than the corpse on the floor. Why? Because in the human being, in the live human being, this matter is composed in a rational relationship. It is rationally ordered, and it is the body of a human being. This is more real. This is greater than just the individual parts. Now, this is where the materialists will say, no, it's not. They'll never be consistent with this because, of course, that would mean there's absolutely nothing wrong with murder, since, after all, if the two things have equal value, killing somebody doesn't in any way deprive anything of value. And so being equivalent, murder wouldn't be wrong. They're never consistent with this, so yeah. Really easy to see. But that's basically the crux of where the materialist is being a reductionist, saying that no, it's all just subatomic particles. There's no greater meaning to any arrangement of it. We project this meaning upon it and then try to claim that doesn't mean murder is just fine, even though it literally intrinsically does. But the reason why murder is wrong, and I'm using murder just because like most people kind of intuit that murder is in fact wrong, and so it's just convenient because it's so widely agreed upon. The fact that murder is wrong shows you that there is something more there than otherwise. You have a rational relationship. You have a greater being composed of lesser beings by them being in a particular relationship to each other. That is what Saint Thomas is talking about when he talks about a natural end. He's not saying that they do something. He's not even saying that they do something that we like. He's saying that they do something wherein their action is itself producing something better by doing this action. So, to give a really, really simple example, the sun. The sun rises and sets every day. Or, the earth spins, and so we only see the sun for part of the time. It's actually a damn good thing for life that this happens, because otherwise, if we were tidally locked to the sun, such that we only ever faced the sun, and the sun never set, what you'd have would be a scorching wasteland on one side and a frozen wasteland on the other, and it'd be some very minor sort of sliver on the two sides where you might be able to have life. And you wouldn't have weather, and there'd be all sorts of other problems. You probably wouldn't be able to, you'd have a great deal of difficulty having things like rain and so on. The fact that the sun rises in the morning and sets in the night, that both of these things, that's not just one or the other, but you have both of these things, makes the world a better place because it enables life to exist. Very, very simple, very trivial example. Now, the thing here, the real key to understanding this, because, I actually sort of picked the sun for a reason, because it's very easy to say, like, oh no, the reason the sun rises is just because the earth is spinning, and so since the earth is spinning under conservation of momentum, started spinning for some reason, we don't know why, but under conservation of, when we look at other planets, they're all spinning too, so obviously it must be just the way things happen. Sweep under the rug. Anyway, it's spinning, conservation of momentum, it just keeps on spinning because there's nothing to slow it down, and so it does that, keeps on doing that. And it just so happened to be in a very convenient sort of speed. Could have been faster, could have been slower, and that would have caused all sorts of problems. But, basically just approximately right to keep life. It's just spinning, conservation of momentum, real simple rule. And so that explains why the sun rises and the sun sets. What more do you need? Well, here's the thing. Because this fifth way is not about, like, why does the sun rise and the sun set? It's about why does the sun rise and the sun set so usefully, so darn conveniently, in such a way as to promote greater being, to promote those greater beings of things like life. And it's just one part. It's just one thing. It's when you look at everything, and this is why when I say it's sort of the most intuitive, you see this all over the place. Things are not universally good, obviously. And this is where we come into the doctrine of the fall. Things are not universally good, so obviously something sort of went wrong with this. But nonetheless, things are remarkably good compared to how they could be. And here we come back to evolution. Evolution, you've got the war of things where they're all just trying to do their stuff, and eventually when you get complex enough that you have heterotrophs, the biological term for things who don't produce their own food from sunlight or from merely something in their environment, but actually get it from other life. That's to say, they eat. Once you get heterotrophs, now life is in competition with each other, and well, actually, it wasn't competition before anyhow. Like plants are in a constant war with each other over trying to get sunlight, but you getting sunlight blocks somebody else from getting sunlight. Being a heterotroph just takes it one step further, because now you go and eat somebody else. And herein you get a really interesting issue that comes up when you have one thing trying to eat another, because there are two sides to this game. On the one side, you try to be really good at eating things, and on the other side, you try to be really, really bad to eat. And this is why so many plants are poisonous. If you know anything about going out camping, hiking, things like that, one of the first rules you get taught, especially if you're young, is don't eat anything you don't actively know is good for you. Because an awful lot of things will be poisonous for you, and you're not going to know until it's too late and you've, either severely injured yourself or killed yourself. Well, here's the thing. It's not that they're poisonous, because evolution will explain quite well why, plants are poisonous, because the poisonous ones were less likely to be eaten, and so more of them flourished. Evolution also explains why is it that some animals are immune to the poisons. Why is it that, grasses have silicates that tend to grind down teeth? Why is it that some animals replace their teeth so frequently? In both cases, there's a relatively simple evolutionary explanation for why you have both sides improving here. What there is not an evolutionary explanation for is why neither side wins. There's nothing in evolution whatsoever that suggests that one of these sides should not win. Why is it that the plant cannot produce a poison that will just kill everything that eats it, and then all herbivores die, and then it's got no more problems? Why is it you don't have herbivores that simply can eat everything? Why is it you don't have carnivores that can eat all the herbivores? Why is it that the herbivores manage to stay eatable enough that the carnivores get food, but not so eatable that the carnivores kill all the herbivores off and then starve to death? And a really, really good example of this is, actually, I want to introduce it. It's bacteria, but I want to introduce it. If you've ever looked at science fiction, you will see the gray goo. If you read enough, you see enough science fiction television and so on, you'll come across the gray goo phenomenon, the idea of self-replicating nanobots. They don't really work exactly, but anyway, where they can sort of eat anything and then turn it into more nanobots, and then you get this explosion of these nanobots that just eat everything and turn it all into a gray goo, because absolutely everything, no matter what it is, just gets turned into more nanobots. And the more of this that happens, the more nanobots there are to turn everything into more nanobots, and so they go through consuming everything, and it wipes out an entire civilization. It's sort of a doomsday weapon. And you see these come up from time to time. Science fiction authors like doomsday weapons. They're interesting and fun. Well, here's the thing. We have nanobots. They're called bacteria. I mean, protozoa too, and so on. But, protists, etc. But we have them. They exist. They're everywhere. They're really, really, really common. And they are very actively trying to eat everything around them and turn it into more bacteria. It's what they do. We've got essentially something like the attempt at a gray goo scenario, where all these bacteria all over the place are constantly trying to eat everything and reproduce. And indeed, if you take anything in which there is any sort of usable calories and leave it around outside, it won't last all that long, because of the many, many, many types of little microbes that will land on it and eat it. So, why don't any of them win? Why don't we actually get a gray goo scenario? Why is it that for bacteria, you always find that like hosts have an immune system that actually works. Why is it for, and it's, oh, I mean, it's so complicated if you get into it, because the interesting things we do using bacteriophages, bacteriophages, viruses that can infect bacteria and stuff, and fascinating things. Like I remember hearing about one study where bacteriophages are concentrated, it's like 15 times more than normal in our mucus, precisely one of the places that bacteria like to enter by, and so we actually seem to harbor enormous numbers of bacteriophages in our mucus, precisely the place where we most encounter hostile bacteria that we're not used to, and so we sort of do germ warfare on the germs. Biology is so fascinating when you get into the details of it. It's so much there. Biology is so incredibly complicated, and so it's sort of very, very fascinating subject. But anyway, the point is, why does that work? Why does it all work? Why is there all this balance where we have microbes and we have, in a sense, macrobes, but large multicellular things and larger ones and larger ones and larger ones. You can do it the other way. The fleas have little, I can't remember. The one about how the fleas have little fleas that bite them and so on ad infinitum. Or the fleas have on them littler fleas that bite them and so on ad infinitum. It's not literally ad infinitum, but there are a bunch of steps in there where you have the smaller and smaller things. You get all these stages and it all works. Why does it all work? And this is really what that fifth proof is about. That fifth proof is really fundamentally at why are all of these things who are following those simple rules, just as the sun follows the simple rule, whichever way you want to do it, depending on where you want to stick your frame of reference, just as the earth spins or just as the sun goes around the earth, either way, because they're mathematically equivalent to each other. Why is it that these things, though they are directed by a simple, unintelligent process, they're just following a straightforward rule, why do they come up with things that are so good? Why do they come up with things that are in a rational relationship to each other? Because one thing, if you study chaotic systems do not tend to stay in unstable balances. They tend to fall down, collapse into a more stable system. This is why plate spinning, you need a plate spinner to come and keep on spinning these things and keep them going and keep them, carefully spinning, because their natural tendency is to just fall down. Why is it for, any number of things, why do you have these phenomenon of taking stuff in places, in complex balances with heavy weather? It's why, for example, I was thinking of the rocks that are stacked, and there are certain places out in the desert you can find these stacked rocks. And one of the things that these stacked rocks tell you is that you never get earthquakes around here. Or virtually never get earthquakes around here. It's why finding stacked rocks where, eventually they got windblown, and what happened was you have these rocks, maybe they fell on each other, and you've got bigger rocks on top of smaller rocks, and it hasn't fallen down. What does this tell you? It's sometimes used for finding geological sites for particular reasons, such as burying nuclear waste or whatever, where you're not going to get earthquakes that destroy buildings. Tells you that things don't really perturb the environment very much. Most of life isn't like that. Most of life has perturbations. In any place you find life, you have one heck of a maelstrom of perturbations, because biology is in constant war. We are in constant war of having bacteria that we're trying to encourage in things like our gut and our skin and so on. On the flip side, all the bacteria who are trying to eat us that we're constantly fighting against, and the bacteria are fighting each other and also cooperating with each other in strange ways and all sorts of things. Life is not like that desert. Life is not a place where you can just see, there's basically no weather and it never shakes here, and so stuff can just remain for a very long time unmoved. That's not what life is normally like. That's not what biology is like at all. Biology is is like being at the seashore with the waves crashing and storms coming in and the occasional earthquake and so on. Biology is just a maelstrom of activity. And why, given this tremendous maelstrom of activity, does the thing stay stable? Everything's just following simple rules. Nothing is trying to keep the system stable. Nothing within it. It's all following these simple, straightforward rules of everything's just trying to reproduce as much as possible and to feed as much as possible and kill off the things it's in competition with as much as possible and so on. And yet, despite everything following these simple rules that do not tend to have a complex system that you can look on and see as good, it doesn't topple over. It doesn't fall into one thing winning and then getting a boring homogeneity. And that is the governance of the world. It is the reconciling of many things that are not of their nature reconciled to each other, keeping them within their appropriate places such that none of them end up destroying everything else. And everything, though it is not intelligent and doesn't know what it's doing, still works together to form this complex good that works, and despite not being stable, continues to work. Because, of course, that is the entire purpose of human law. Human law, law that is given by an intelligence, is always, its whole purpose is to take a chaotic system and keep it in an unstable balance, is to keep it from doing the sorts of things that it naturally wants to do. Why do you have, laws against stealing? Well, because left to themselves, people will tend to just take whatever they want, but that creates a terrible, terrible result if people just steal things from each other, because then they're just constantly fighting and no one's building, and things go really, really bad. Laws against stealing prevent this natural tendency. They prevent the degradation of society into the stable state if nobody has everything and then everybody dies of starvation. These laws maintain the unstable state where people walk by stuff that they want and don't reach out and take it. The whole point of the law is to keep this unstable state stable. Through active exertion of will and energy, you maintain a balance that should topple over. That's what laws, in the human sense of laws, are all about. And this is why when you look at nature, you can see that there is a governance at work, that there is law in that intentional sort of sense, because the stuff should not keep working. It should topple over, it should fall, it should come to some sort of much more boring, stable condition. And yet it never does. It doesn't do that. And so this is the governance of the world that St. Thomas is referring to. And this is why it really is, if you get past the taking the governance of the world to mean like why do animals look different? Why do squirrels have bushy tails or whatever? But rather not that, but why is it that all of these things that just follow their simple, that follow their own simple rules, why do they end up working together even though none of them are trying to work together? Why do we have an unstable state that continues in an unstable state and just keeps going in this unstable state and never becomes stable? Why is it kept in this unstable state that is better rather than degenerating into a more boring, morally worse, stable state? That's the governance of the world, and that's the thing if you're looking for it. When you just look outside, you just, spend a few minutes outside. I'll grant you, it kind of helps to be an adult and have spent a while learning about things to see how this stuff actually works. But, and then spend a few minutes outside and you will be reminded of all the things you know about how mountains tend to come tumbling, erode over time, trees tend to die off and all the rest of it. And why is it that all this stuff just keeps on working? And that's the governance of the world. And it's pretty straightforward when you actually look for it. And that's why I think it is, though it is not, it takes a bunch of explanation in one sense. In another sense, it's extremely intuitive. The problem is everybody has a partial explanation already. Just by being in modern culture and hearing about evolution and so on, everyone is already not in the realm of the intuitive, but in a sort of partial explanation, which is why these days you need sort of a fuller explanation to be able to see the intuitiveness of it. But in any event, that is the governance of the world, and that's why I think it is really the most understandable, the most widely intelligible of the proofs that St. Thomas gave for God. Because as long as you're not messing up what it actually is, misunderstanding it, it's just so intuitive when you just sort of look at stuff and have something of a sense for how everything tends to degenerate. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.